Okay, we continue in Jeremiah 52. We got up to verse 12 last week. We're talking about the temple and the city being plundered and burned. This is the final time that Nebuchadnezzar came in 586 BC and laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. When he got in, he had done the same thing in 597, 11 years earlier, before he had put Zedekiah in as king. But that time he looted some of the wealth, some of the golden things that were in the temple. He took some treasure, but he left everything intact. This time they do not. As we'll see here in just a few verses, not only do they burn everything, they loot everything, they also tear the walls down in Jerusalem. And that's significant later in the book of Nehemiah. They go back to rebuild, they return from captivity to rebuild the temple, but they're not safe. They don't have walls to protect them from. And that's why Nehemiah is necessary to come and build those walls of Jerusalem back. So we pick up in verse 12, and it gives very specific dates. Now, in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, so we can cross-reference it with the Babylonian timetable and their history. And so we know very specifically when this is. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a high official. All kings had an elite guard. And so this would be, Nebuzaradan would be a significant lieutenant of Nebuchadnezzar, a very high official. And he is sent to take care of Jerusalem, who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem to finish it off, basically, what was left of it. He burned the house of the Lord. So first thing he did was I say the first thing he did. The first thing he did was to loot everything of value. We'll see they're even tearing down the columns inside the temple because they're coated with bronze, and they are breaking that bronze up and carrying the bronze back to Babylon. Bronze is not as expensive as gold, but it's still valuable. And then he burns the house of the Lord and the king's house, the palace, the great palace that Solomon built. Both these things were built by Solomon about 400 and some years previous. Solomon had built all these things. All the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great, he burned with fire. So they didn't burn the slums. They burned all the significant, nice houses, places that you would want to live in. Verse 14, and all of the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down all the walls of Jerusalem all around. All right? So in the ancient world, it was dangerous to be alive. Individuals had a lot of trouble surviving by themselves. So people would gravitate towards cities because cities would be walled, and when an invader came, you could take your family and a few valuables and go hide inside the walls. Now, it was in ancient warfare, it was very difficult to take a walled city. You had to lay siege. You basically had to starve people to death because it would just cost so many soldiers to conquer a walled city. So Jerusalem has rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, I believe, 3 times by this point. And so he's not going to have it anymore. He said, take the walls down. I believe there has been some archaeological studies where they have the big stones of the walls were dragged miles and miles away from Jerusalem. They didn't just tear them down and leave the stuff there. They dragged the stones away so they couldn't rebuild it easily. So they would have to when Nehemiah comes and rebuilds the walls of the city, he has to get the Persian king to give him a lot of, to requisition him a lot of resources in order to rebuild those walls. So they made it so they can't come back, recollect there, and rebuild the walls and resist again. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive some of the poor people. The rest of the people, the poorest, who remained in the city, the defectors who had deserted to the king of Babylon, and the rest of the craftsmen. So he took some of the poor, he took the craftsmen, the deserters, defectors, but he left the poorest of the poor there. He said, fend for yourself. To understand this next passage, we need to remember Jeremiah's conflict with the false prophet in Jeremiah 27, Hananiah. Jeremiah had predicted that all the furnishings still remaining in the temple would be taken to Babylon, which is what's about to happen. Hananiah contradicted him. I believe Hananiah struck Jeremiah, and he promised not only would they not take the rest of it says the furniture, the candle stands and the golden plates and all those things that are in the temple. Not only would they not take anything else, the stuff that had already been looted in 597, 598 would be brought back. Which prophet was correct? Well, it was Jeremiah. Hananiah was saying what was very popular to the king and to the court, and people probably cheered and clapped, and probably when he struck Jeremiah, they clapped even louder. But Jeremiah was speaking the word of God. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some poor of the land as vine dressers and farmers. Just completing that thought from the last slide. Now the bronze pillars in the temple and the carts where they carted different things around and took sacrifices, the bronze sea, so the big, outside the temple was a big wash basin. I mean, big enough to get down in there and bathe. And it was called the sea, the S-E-A. Was made of bronze. The Chaldeans broke all these things into pieces and carried all the bronze to Babylon. Then it gives a full description of this great undertaking of how much work they had to do in order to get all this stuff. They also took away the pots, the shovels, the trimmers, the bowls, the spoons, and all the bronze utensils which the priest had ministered. All the different things that they used to do the sacrifices, to put the sacrifices up on the brazen altar. Brazen means bronze altar. I'm sure the knives and swords, cleavers that they used to sacrifice the animals, everything. They took the basins, the fire pans underneath the brazen altar, the bowls, the pots, the lampstands, the spoons, the cups, whatever was solid gold, whatever was solid silver, the captain of the guard took away. Any precious metal they took away. They left nothing. They left nothing of value. It goes on to describe the great pillars inside. And if you remember back to Kings, the book of Kings, describing the process of building this temple by Solomon, they went through anything that was left of value they took. The 2 pillars, 1 sea, the 12 bronze bulls, which were under the sea. And so they had a circle with the bronze bull's head. There were 12 of them representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and the sea was on their back. They took all those bulls, the carts, which King Solomon had made for the temple. The bronze of all these articles was beyond measure. Now concerning those pillars, these are giant pillars. I want to think 40-foot high pillars, big around. You probably could not reach around the pillars. And in the middle they were wood, but they were coated with bronze. Now concerning the pillars, the height of the pillar was 18 cubits. So 18, a cubit is a foot and a half. So that would be what? 27 feet high, not 40. 27 feet high. A measuring line of 12 cubits could measure its circumference. So that would be 16 feet around. So my span is probably 6.5 feet. So I'd only go about a third of the way around, a little more than a third of the way around one of these pillars. And its thickness was 4 fingers. It was hollow. So these are hollow. I thought they had wood in the middle, but apparently they're hollow. I think the 4 fingers would be the thickness of the bronze. So if you can imagine 16 feet around, 27 feet tall, and about 4 fingers thick with a hollow middle were these bronze columns. That's a lot of bronze. Further description of the pillars. Just so you know, a capital, which is at the top, so if you look at these lights up here, the capital would be the top of the cylinder there. That is a kind of a golden color. And they had, so at the top of the pillars, they had these capitals, and they had little pomegranate decorations made out of bronze. So the capital of the bronze was on a pillar, and the height of the capital was 5 cubits. So this capital, decoration was 7 feet tall. So 27-foot pillars and about 7 more feet for the capital, with a network and pomegranates all around the capital. The second pillar with pomegranates was the same. 96 pomegranates on the sides of the pillars. All the pomegranates all around the network were 100. So very ornate, very fancy pillars, and everything was made of bronze. Now it switches back over to the people being taken captive. The captain of the guard took Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second chief priest, the number 2 guy, and then the 3 doorkeepers of the temple. He also took out of the city an officer over the men of war, so one of the generals, 7 men of the king's close associates found in the city, so the inner circle of the King Zedekiah, the principal scribe of the army who mustered the people of the land. That the scribe is the one who kept track of who was in the army, and the people of the land, when they would serve, he would, I'm sure they would take a census to know how many soldiers they could count on, and 60 random men found in the midst of the city. He took those people, and Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. Riblah is north and east of Jerusalem. Then the king of Babylon struck them and put them to death at Riblah. The generals, the high priest, he executed them in the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive from its own land. Deportations of exiles. Now this information is probably secondary deportations. This list does not fully agree with the king's list, and we could talk about the reasons that 2 different lists don't agree. Most likely, we can never know for sure, but most likely there were people continually being taken from Judah. As people turned up and were captured, they were carried away in different groups. And so what list you are looking at depends on who was making the list. So it says in verse 28, these are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive in the seventh year. There were, and the other thing that's confusing about these lists, ancient lists, because they just thought of numbers and things differently, and they wrote things down differently than we will. Often they will give a summary before of a total. So this 3023 may be a summary, but it may be a standalone number to be added to the other numbers. And so you see how that can be confusing in adding things up. So if they said, we would say a total of 5,000 people were taken, and that was made up of 1,000 of these type, 1,000 of these, and so forth. But they might say 5,000 people were taken, and then 800 people were taken, and then 900 people were taken. And so if you're adding all those up, you get way more than 5,000. And so it's a little bit confusing. But this is what the text says. In the seventh year, there were 3,023 Jews. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, so in his 7th year, they took 3,000. In his 18th year, 11 years later. So that 7th year, I believe, is the 597 siege before, where Zedekiah was made king. So before Zedekiah, they took away 3,000. Now that was the second deportation. The first deportation would have been back, I think in 601, was when Daniel went to Babylon. In 97, they took a total of 3,023, and I think that is when Ezekiel went to Babylon. Then in the 18th year, which would be 11 years later, that is the 586, where they tore the walls down. Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive from Judah 832 persons. In his 23rd year, 5 years later, so about 582, Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, carried away 745 captive Jews. In all, 4,600 persons. And as I say, those lists don't jive with some of the other lists in Kings. And we know that way more than 4,600 people were taken total. And so this list is a partial list from somebody's collection. So that basically is the end of the deportation. Now it jumps forward. So that was 582 BC. Now it jumps forward 21 more years for this section. Now it came to pass in the 37th year of captivity of Jehoiachin. Now, reviewing back a little bit, after Josiah the good king, he had 3 sons. 3 of his 4 sons became king, and 1 grandson. Jehoiachin was the grandson. He's also known as Jeconiah. So he was Josiah's grandson. He was the son of Jehoiakim, the second king, after Josiah. And he was king. He was appointed Jeconiah was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, his father, Jehoiakim, had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, had stopped sending money to Nebuchadnezzar. So when Nebuchadnezzar was coming for the 597 siege, Jehoiakim died. A lot of people believe that they assassinated Jehoiakim because he had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar was coming. And so they basically surrendered after a short siege, and he made Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, king. He was king for 3 months. I don't know why. It doesn't give an explanation why only 3 months. And then Nebuchadnezzar arrested Jehoiachin took him to Babylon. Once he got to Babylon, that would be 597, 598, 597. Their calendar is a little bit different than ours. BC. So 597 years before Jesus was born, his ancestor, Jehoiachin, was taken to Babylon and put in prison. He was there for 37 years in prison in Babylon. Now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, which would have been March 21st, 560 BC. Now I just realized that that was 2,583 years and 1 day before we started studying the book of Jeremiah. What do you think about that? We started on March 22nd of, oh, no, not 83, 82 years. Anyway, evil Marduk, king of Babylon. Evil Marduk was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. In the first year of his reign, when he became king, I'm sorry, he was a son or a grandson. I'm not exactly sure. He might have been a son. Anyway, when he started his reign, he lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. Okay? So when Nebuchadnezzar died, they had rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the next king, brought him out, and let him become a part of the court. I think Jehoiachin began sitting at the king's table and being a part of the court of the king at that point, living a more affluent life. And he spoke kindly to Jehoiachin, evil Marduk did, and gave him more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So made him an important dignitary. So Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. And in fact, we've looked at it another time, they have found, they call it the Jeconiah cylinder in Babylon. They have found a record of, and it was an administrative tablet of bread allotted to Jehoiachin's household by the Babylonian officials. And so that's a historical, we would say a historical fact the Bible is lining up with here. And this is the end of the book of Jeremiah. And as for his provisions, there was regular ration given to him by the king of Babylon, a portion for each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. Now, why is Jeconiah important? Why is it important that they end the book of Jeremiah, this long, hard book? This is a book of judgment. Judah has been judged for their apostasy and for turning their back and not repenting. And it is very much a final judgment. I would say definitely the book of Jeremiah is a fulfillment of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant was about blessings and curses. If you obey the Lord your God, he will bless you, keep you safe. And if you turn your back on the Lord your God, he will curse you, he will send pestilence and the sword, and he will take you away from the land he's given you. That's what the book of Jeremiah is about. Judah turned its back on God, and God is fulfilling the old covenant. Now, in the process of doing that, God made a new covenant. If you remember the book of consolation, Jeremiah 29 through 31, in the midst, right in the middle of the book of Jeremiah, he said, but you know what? I'm going to give you a new covenant. I'm going to punish you, and then I'm going to give you a new covenant. And it's not like the one you broke, the one you failed to keep, the one I gave your forefathers. I will write my words on your heart, meaning it's going to be faith. It's not about obedience. It's about what you have in your heart. And he said, I will forgive your sins and remember them no more. That's radically different than the Old Covenant. Now, there's lots of similarities, there's lots of overlap, and I wouldn't say the Old Covenant has 100% passed away, because there were promises made in the Old Covenant related to land and territory that have not yet been fulfilled. I think that Old Covenant is still partially in play with the Israelite people, and that's the way of God. The ways of God and prophecy and spirit don't always make perfect sense to us, but I think partially the Old Covenant is still in play. But God has sent a new covenant. And we see Jesus says in Matthew 26:27, this is a new covenant in my blood, and I was taken for the remission of sin. Now, why is Jeconiah important? Well, if you go into Matthew, the book of Matthew, verse 11 through 16, kind of summarized it here. King Josiah begot Jeconiah. We know that is a conflation. Jeconiah begot Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim begat Jeconiah. But the numbers work better if it's straight there. So Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers as they were carried away to Babylon. In Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and he begot Zerubbabel. If you remember, Zerubbabel is the one who led with Ezra, led the first big group of Jews back from Babylon to Jerusalem, and they began to work on the temple. Zerubbabel. On down the line, it said later, Matan begot Jacob, who begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom was born Jesus. So the book ends, and I would say, I don't know if I should say a disappointment. I thought that Jeremiah would be more messianic. Most of the Old Testament is very messianic. I haven't found Jeremiah to be very messianic. Jeremiah was bringing judgment. It's too late. You know, God would say to Jeremiah would begin weeping. God would say, don't pray for the Jews. It's too late. Tell them to take their medicine and go to Babylon, because they've turned their back on me, they broke the covenant, and this is judgment. This is judgment on their disobedience. That's what Jeremiah has been about. But it's very interesting that it ends. On the end of the book is what? A word of hope. Jeconiah has been let out of jail. And who's going to come from Jeconiah? The Messiah. And so Jeremiah ends. The final word in Jeremiah is, watch out, here comes Jesus. Here comes Jesus. Are there any questions? That was a lot of fun, wasn't it? Jeremiah is a long book. Any questions or comments about that? We'll go from here. We'll begin Lamentations chapter 1 next week. We'll spend a couple weeks in Lamentations, and then we'll go to the book of James. So let's close right there and say a prayer and be dismissed.